Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and every single one of you is really, really good at interpreting stories. You intuit the beats of a story, whether it be something overt like a book or a movie or TV show or something, or even more subtle stories like an advertisement or listening to a friend tell you something about what happened, or just observing the world around you. You're really good at picking this stuff out. You see commonalities, you learn the pacing and the beats, and every now and then a story messes with you. It subverts your expectations, and that can be kind of fun from time to time. But for the most part, you know what's coming and how things need to work out. But let's just take a second and run Matthew 27. And what we're seeing here is Jesus goes to the cross through that story interpretation filter. Try to forget that you know what's coming. How would this normally work out? All right. You got a guy who was predicted to be a really big deal. He's got the right pedigree. He's got all of the proper lineage and titles and all of that, but he's also a man of the people. He's humble, and all of those ugly parts that you would normally expect to show up in a character to round him out and make him seem more relatable or complete, those just don't show up. Instead, it looks like we're dealing with a main character who's simultaneously the underdog and the obvious undefeatable, indisputable winner. There's inevitability both to his death, it feels like, but also to his victory. How can both of those things that our storytelling spidey sense is telling us, how can they both be true at once? There are familiar beats to this story, but something also feels weird and different. He goes and he helps people. He says things that make sense. We get hints from his enemies early on that he really is something very, very special. He gathers a group of nobodies to himself. They seem to be accomplishing great things. He has mastery over the laws of time and space. The intellectual, political, and religious elites of the day have nothing on him. They can't beat him. All of their dirty tricks, they pull them all out against him. But he always knows what to say. He always knows what to do. And the harder his enemies try to wreck him, the more compelling he looks. Well, a normal person would just stay away from the hive of scum and villainy where all of the enemies live and just live out his days and accomplish things in another geographic location. But the main character in this story doesn't do that. He turns his face resolutely toward Jerusalem and marches in that direction, knowing what he's walking into. Once there, he doesn't go small. He doesn't try to patch it up. He doesn't try to look for lots of compromise points to make it work. He goes right at it and says a whole bunch of true things that nobody else is going to say, that nobody else is willing to say, even if it's going to cost him dearly. And now all of a sudden we get to this point in the story and it looks like it is going to cost him dearly. But that feels wrong because he's perfect, not perfect like a Mary Sue, where a character is just written boringly with no problems. In this case, the main character has problems, massive problems. They just aren't his. His problem, his burden is literally everyone else. He is taking on everybody else's character flaws, everybody else's missteps, not just their personal flubs, but the institutional ones where you can't even point to the person who got it wrong in the first place or who is sustaining the wrongness now. All of that concrete and abstract evil and failure and character flaw, all of that he is taking upon himself while not having any of those that generate from himself. So this is a little weird, and it does mess with the story. So I go back to the question I was asking you earlier. We get to this point in the story, right? You're very good at interpreting stories. You know the beats. What should be coming up next? Does it feel to you like one of those sports stories where the good team is the underdog and they're the ones you follow, and no matter how long the odds are, you always know they're going to end up winning the game? Or is it maybe the more nuanced sports story where the underdog is going to go ahead and lose, but in the end, they're going to win something even bigger? Does it feel like a tragedy where you root for the point of view character, but ultimately their flaws are too numerous and they boomerang back around on them and tragically they die and everything goes wrong? Does it maybe feel like one of those cautionary tales about being too much the good guy like Ned Stark, and your own attempts at doing every single thing the right way burns you, and the lesson is, well, you just should have been more shrewd and sophisticated? Does it feel like the hero's journey where The underdog, who is the chosen one, receives elite training from a mentor and overcomes threshold guardians and gains allies along the way, and then overcomes their darkest hour to rise up and defeat their enemy. I don't know. I don't think any of those are totally satisfying, right? If this story that we're in Act 3 of fit neatly into those categories, we would have a really clear sense of how things ought to work out next. But I think if you can forget for a minute that you know how this story works out, the reality is that if somebody picked this book up in the first century and they really didn't know and they really hadn't heard, I don't know what they would be thinking at this point. I think they'd be going back and forth with a buddy who they're reading it with and like, well, there's just no way. Look, he did this and this, and how could you forget about that? He clearly has command of nature. You can't crucify a guy like that. It's not going to work. Or maybe they'll put him up there and eye lasers. I don't know, but I just don't see him dying. Maybe the other guy is like, but he said he had to. He can't be wrong. Look at everything else. He's been right about everything. How could he be wrong in a prediction about his own death? I think he's going to die, and I think he's actually going to come back to life, and somehow that's good. But at this point in the story, could you understand yet how that would be the victory that it's supposed to be? Maybe. I think so, but with a pretty careful reading. Nah, my friends, this is a weird story, and it's why it could be argued that pretty much all the stories really before and since are either a riff on this story, they're moving forward with this story, the best stories in humanity are drawing on elements of this story, or stories try somehow to mock or jape on what this story is, but ultimately this is one of those stories that just doesn't seem like it is mockable. It's a strange one because it's both the most famous, most repeated story ever told, and also the main character is so different and other than all the characters and all the other stories, and the stakes are so different and other that it's also the most unique story ever told. Well, as you know, the way this one plays out is Jesus was indeed right. He said he was going to go to the cross. He said that the chief priests and the elders, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders, his enemies, were going to kill him, and that's what happens. Matthew 27 says, after they mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon. We talked a bunch about him. And they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. I mean, it just sounds like it, doesn't it? Golgotha. Maybe those associations are baked in because I've associated the place of the skull with the term Golgotha since I was old enough to understand words, but it just sounds right. It sounds like something Skeletor would say using his cackly skull face. It just has a haunting sound to it. And apparently this location, which some people say, oh yeah, it was definitely right there. I think it's safe to say that this is a location that is highly disputed, and probably it's one of the main guesses that are out there for where this exact spot would be. But wherever exactly it was in pretty close proximity to the city itself. I mean, you don't want to go too far out of town. You can't make a point with the crucifixion anymore. You need people to be able to see it. But it was also certainly a place that had no positive connotations. That is not where you end up. And that's where you're taking Jesus. And I picture the lighting changing. I picture the day rolling on into something that's a twisting up of day and night, both for biblical reasons and just thematic reasons. I imagine that. And the closer he gets to this moment, the more maybe some readers who didn't know how this worked out are going, there's no way they're going to kill this guy. They just can't. How could he die? You can't kill this main character. This isn't a Greek tragedy. What is going on here? But we're running out of time for there to be an interruption, for the cavalry to show up, for this thing to be broken up somehow. But the text goes on after they get to Golgotha with Jesus all roughed up and his cross there ready to be assembled, raised up, that is, and it says there they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. That's like the last thing you do before you actually start putting somebody on the cross. I think Matthew gives us a really interesting detail here, by the way, that he knows that members of the original audience were there. He knows that people saw him put that to his mouth, but he also wants to make it really clear that Jesus refused it upon tasting it, and that clearly he wants to keep his mind straight, and He doesn't want to be numbed from this. He wants to feel every last bit of what he's doing. So I think Matthew's doing two things here. One, he's answering the question about, well, wait, didn't he like taste it or something? I was there. I thought I saw that. But the bigger thing I think Matthew's trying to do here is to say, no. He didn't even take the painkiller. He is leaning into this all the way. He is not ducking one bit of this punishment. He's willing to receive it all. Why would a guy do that? Why would a story follow these beats? Why would it play out all upside down like that? Well, there are no more off-ramps because the very next verse says, when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. He's up there at this point in the story, and it really is jarring that it's come to this. It feels out of sorts in terms of the narrative beats we're familiar with, and it feels grossly unjust and entirely backwards. I mean, maybe you could imagine a character this compelling showing up and having people be like, nah, we're going to take a pass. We're just not going to sign up for that. But to have it flip all the way from not a positive response to not just a neutral response, to not just an angry negative response, but straight up kill him when he has the words of life and he's initiating the kingdom of God, the kingdom of life. Wow. It's staggering, and that's the way it's meant to hit us. And Matt, this is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.